Ever feel like you're looking at the world, particularly the political world, through a specific lens, but you can't quite articulate what that lens is?
Mm.
Or maybe you're trying to understand a complex political issue, but different analyses of the same topic seem to just contradict each other.
Yeah, that can be really confusing, like everyone's talking past each other.
Exactly. It can be truly disorienting, feeling like everyone's speaking a different language. Well, today we're taking a deep dive into the foundational approaches that shape how we study and understand politics.
Okay.
Think of these as, I don't know, different toolkits or fundamental perspectives that political thinkers use to make sense of the incredibly complex world around us.
Right.
These aren't just dry academic distinctions. They're really the very bedrock of how we frame political problems, how we analyze power, and even how we imagine solutions.
That's right. And we'll explore a fascinating array of these intellectual traditions, from those seeking a kind of scientific understanding, trying to mimic the natural sciences, to those focused much more on deep-seated values or the dynamics of power, or even how language itself shapes our reality.
Right.
Understanding these approaches helps you not just know what people are saying, but really grasp how they're interpreting the world.
Yeah.
It gives you like a powerful shortcut to being truly well-informed. It lets you see the underlying assumptions behind pretty much every political argument or policy proposal out there.
That sounds incredibly useful. Our material today comes from a deep and detailed text on key concepts in politics, so it gives us a really solid grounding in these critical frameworks.
Good stuff.
It's like getting a masterclass in political thought without having to, pore over hundreds of pages yourself. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So let's start with a foundational concept that really underpins a huge swath of political analysis.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to be an empirical thinker in politics?
Okay, so at its core, empiricism is the doctrine that, well, sense experience is the only valid basis of knowledge.
Sense experience. So what you see, hear, touch.
Exactly. This means that for something to be considered knowledge, all hypotheses and theories about it must be rigorously tested by observation and experiment. Think of John Locke's idea of the mind as a tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
The blank slate, right. Information is imprinted solely by the senses. This isn't about some kind of internal revelation or just abstract reasoning in isolation. It's about what you can see, hear, touch, and measure in the world around you.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about it historically. This empirical tradition isn't new at all, is it? It seems to be rooted in some of the earliest systematic political thought.
Not at all, no. You can trace its roots all the way back to ancient Greece with Aristotle's meticulous attempts to classify different constitutions.
Right, he wasn't just making it up.
No, he was observing and categorizing real-world political systems. Then you jump forward to Machiavelli in the Renaissance with his, well, brutally realistic account of statecraft, looking at how rulers actually behave.
Rather than how they should behave.
Yeah, precisely. And Montesquieu with his sociological theory of government and law, examining societal structures and their impact in different contexts. These foundational works, really, they form the basis of what we now call comparative government.
Okay.
And they are deeply descriptive. They aim to analyze and explain political reality dispassionately, focusing on what is.
Which is very different from a normative approach.
Exactly. That normative approach is prescriptive. It's making judgments, offering recommendations based on what ought to be. Empiricism sticks to describing what is.
So if you're listening to a policy debate or a news analysis, and one person is constantly citing statistics, polls, observed outcomes, and another is talking about fundamental rights or ideal justice, you're essentially watching an empirical thinker debating a normative one.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It immediately tells you what kind of evidence they value most.
Yeah.
And this empirical drive seems to be what really pushed the study of politics towards becoming something more like a science. How did that evolution take place?
Precisely. Empiricism provided the groundwork for positivism, which then really underpinned the rise of what we call political science as a distinct academic discipline.
Okay, positivism.
Yeah. Positivism is the doctrine that social sciences should strictly adhere to the methods of the natural sciences. Auguste Comte, who popularized the term from Saint-Simon, basically believed that science held a monopoly on knowledge. It was the only reliable path to understanding.
Wow, monopoly.
Pretty much. And the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 30s took this even further. They rejected any proposition that couldn't be empirically verified as simply meaningless.
Hold on. So they're basically saying if you can't see it, touch it, or measure it,
Yeah.
it's not real knowledge.
Uh-huh.
That's a pretty radical claim when you think about abstract concepts like justice or freedom.
Yeah.
You can't exactly put justice under a microscope.
It was a huge, almost audacious claim, yeah. And it had a profound significance in the academic world. Positivism in the 20th century greatly weakened the status of political philosophy.
How so?
Well, concepts like justice, rights, liberty, they were often dismissed as metaphysical, not dealing with external measurable phenomena. And therefore, from this strict positivist viewpoint, they were meaningless.
Wow.
This shift was crucial in underpinning the emergence of political science as a distinct field, one that sought to emulate the rigor and objectivity of physics or biology. It shifted the focus away from those abstract moral questions towards observable, quantifiable phenomena.
And this pursuit of scientific rigor led to what's often called a revolution in political thought. We're talking about behavioralism here. How did that take these positivist ideas into the actual study of politics?
Yes, the behavioral revolution of the 1950s, that really made behavioralism the dominant force in U.S. political science, and it had a powerful influence globally, too.
Okay.
So behavioralism is the belief that social theory should be constructed only on the basis of observable behavior. It's important, by the way, to distinguish this from behaviorism, the psychological school about conditioned reflexes.
Right, different thing.
Different thing. Behavioralism in politics adopted positivism's core assertion. Scientific knowledge must be verifiable or falsifiable based on what you can actually see and measure.
So it really pushed for a data-driven approach.
Hmm.
Can you give us a concrete example of what this scientific approach looked like in practice for political scientists? Like, what would a behavioralist actually do?
Absolutely. A behavioralist would typically involve the systematic collection of quantifiable data. Think large-scale surveys, precise statistical analysis,
Numbers.
lots of numbers, and constructing empirical theories that aim to have predictive capacity. So, for instance, rather than debating the philosophical merits of different voting systems, a behavioralist would analyze voter turnout statistics, survey voter preferences before and after elections, maybe track the specific policy decisions of legislators, cross-referencing them with campaign promises, things like that. David Easton, a key figure, really believed that politics could genuinely adopt the methodology of the natural sciences, using quantitative methods to study everything from voter behavior to lobbyists, even local politicians.
Right.
It offered this seemingly objective, measurable way to understand political phenomena, moving beyond just describing constitutions or abstract formative ideas. It was seen as giving the study of politics proper scientific credentials.
So thinking about things like voter turnout, how legislators vote, how lobbyists operate, sounds so concrete, so objective. You collect data, run statistics, seems straightforward.
Yeah.
But there were significant criticisms of this approach, right?
Yeah.
It couldn't be quite that simple.
You're right to point that out. Despite its appeal and apparent rigor, behavioralism faced significant criticism, especially from the 1960s onwards. One major critique was its constrained scope.
How so?
Well, by insisting on only what was directly observable and quantifiable, it threatened to reduce the entire discipline of politics to, well, little else beyond numerical data. While it produced invaluable insights in fields like voting studies and public opinion, its narrow obsession with quantifiable data meant it couldn't fully address many crucial but less measurable aspects of political life. Things like the role of ideas, culture, or power dynamics that aren't immediately visible.
And what about its claim to be objective and value-free? That sounds like a big promise to make in the messy world of politics. Can any social science really be entirely value-free?
That was another major point of contention. Its claims of objectivity, reliability, and being value-free were frequently challenged. Critics argued these claims were compromised by unstated biases.
Like what kind of biases?
Well, for example, if democracy was redefined only in terms of observable behavior, it tended to mean what was happening in developed Western political systems at the time.
Okay, so it took the status quo as the definition.
Pretty much. This inadvertently disengaged the concept of democracy from broader, maybe more normative ideas like popular participation, genuine public accountability, or the pursuit of social justice. It effectively ended up legitimizing existing power structures under the guise of scientific neutrality.
So it inadvertently narrowed the definition of democracy to fit what was easily measurable in certain contexts, rather than maybe challenging the status quo.
Precisely. Furthermore, behavioralism was criticized for treating human behavior as if it were entirely predictable and determined by objective factors, like clockwork.
Right, but people aren't really like that.
Exactly. This overlooks the incredibly complex and variable mix of psychological, social, cultural, and historical influences that actually shape human action. Humans aren't just cogs in a machine. Our motivations are multifaceted, often contradictory.
So what happened then? Did it just disappear?
Not entirely, but it led to the emergence of post-behavioralism. This was a recognition that, look, theory inevitably imposes meaning on data. Your theoretical perspective can and does impact seemingly objective observations.
Ah, so admitting interpretation matters.
Exactly. It was an acknowledgement that values and interpretation can't be completely separated from analysis, even when you're trying to be scientific.
So what does this all mean for us trying to understand politics today? It sounds like it highlights this ongoing tension between seeking hard facts and acknowledging the fundamental messiness, maybe even subjectivity, of human behavior and political life. We can't escape interpretation entirely, can we?
No, we absolutely cannot. It's a constant dance between empirical observation and theoretical interpretation. The legacy of behavioralism is important. It pushed for more rigorous, data-driven analysis, which is invaluable for certain questions.
Sure.
But post-behavioralism reminds us that the questions we ask, the data we choose to collect, how we interpret it, these are always, to some degree, shaped by our own perspectives and values. It forces a more humble, maybe self-aware approach to political inquiry. It makes us ask whose values might be embedded in this data or in this interpretation.
That really highlights how our own perspectives shape what we see. Okay, but what about those who argue that it's only ideas and grand principles that truly shape reality, or at least how we should organize it? That's where idealism comes in, operating in a very different plane, isn't it?
Yes. Idealism is a concept understood in two main senses. First, there's what you might call metaphysical idealism.
Okay.
This is the belief that, in the final analysis, only ideas exist. Reality itself is understood in terms of consciousness or mental phenomena. Think of Plato.
The forms.
Exactly. The true reality lies in perfect, unchanging forms or ideas. Or Kant and Hegel, who believe that meaning isn't just inherent in the external world, but is imposed by the knowing subject, by our minds.
Right.
This perspective contrasts sharply with philosophical materialism, the idea that only matter exists, and with empiricism, which says knowledge comes only from sensory experience.
So it's about the mind shaping reality, or at least our understanding of it. And then there's political idealism, which sounds a bit more tangible, but still very principle-driven. Maybe what many people think of when they hear idealist.
Exactly. Political idealism refers to theories or practices characterized by an unbending commitment to certain ideals or principles.
Like justice or peace.
Precisely. In international politics, for example, an idealist perspective views international relations through the lens of values and norms like justice, peace, international law. It's less concerned with how international actors do behave, that's the empirical realist approach, and more with how they should behave.
Right.
It's often seen as a kind of species of utopianism because it can be perceived as focusing on seemingly impossible goals, aspiring to something beyond current reality.
What's fascinating here is the historical influence and enduring strengths of idealism, despite its critics who might call it naive or unrealistic.
Indeed. Metaphysical idealism profoundly underpinned much of classical, medieval, and early modern political philosophy. Its strength was providing this firm universalist perspective for judging existing arrangements and for political advocacy.
How so?
Well, if values like justice and natural law are implicit in the structure of reality itself, it gives thinkers a powerful universal standard against which to measure contemporary societies. Its status did erode, though, as empirical and scientific approaches gained ground, demanding those measurable facts.
And political idealism, even if it's sometimes ridiculed as utopian, still seems to have a powerful pull, doesn't it? I mean, think about social justice movements throughout history.
Absolutely. Despite criticisms that it encourages unrealistic goals or fails to acknowledge practical considerations like the raw pursuit of power, political idealism has an undeniable and enduring capacity to inspire commitment and activism.
Like Gandhi or Martin Luther King.
Exactly. Think of figures like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. Their movements were fundamentally driven by unbending commitments to ideals like nonviolence and equality, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
Right.
To simply downgrade the importance of ideals and principles in political analysis, some would argue, might just legitimize unprincipled behavior and pure power-seeking.
Hmm.
This very concern has led to the emergence of neo-idealism in international politics, which emphasizes the practical value of morality, human rights, and interdependence in a world that might otherwise seem driven solely by self-interest. It's a reminder that visions of what could be are powerful motivators.
Now, from these perhaps more abstract ideals, let's move to concrete structures that shape our political lives. Institutionalism. This sounds like a much more grounded approach.
Institutionalism, yes. As an approach to political analysis, it focuses on making sense of political realities by studying the causes and consequences of political institutions.
Okay, what counts as an institution here?
An institution, in this context, is an enduring, stable set of arrangements that regulates individual and group behavior based on established rules and procedures, often formal and legal, with explicit, enforceable rules, typically part of the state machinery, things like constitutions, elections, parliaments, bureaucracies, party systems. This approach views institutions as political actors in their own right, capable of influencing wider social, economic, and cultural forces, not just being products of them.
So it's like saying the rules of the game themselves are powerful players, not just a neutral backdrop for the real action. How has this approach evolved over time?
It has a long history. Traditional institutionalism was dominant until the 1950s. You can trace it back to Plato and Aristotle, and it was developed further by thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, all examining which institutions might best secure political goods like justice or freedom.
Right.
This traditional approach focused on detailed descriptions of institutional behavior, formal rules, and comparative historical examinations of structures. For instance, analyzing differences between codified and uncodified constitutions, or parliamentary versus presidential systems. It was often descriptive, like early empiricism, but focused squarely on the structure of government itself. However, since the 1980s, we've seen the rise of new institutionalism, or neo-institutionalism.
Neo-institutionalism. Okay, what's new about it?
Well, while it's not a single monolithic theory, it tends to recognize the importance of informal as well as formal institutions.
Informal, like unwritten rules.
Exactly. Looking beyond just the written rules or official bodies to consider unwritten norms, cultural practices, habitual ways of doing things that also shape behavior. It moves beyond purely formal legal approaches. It reflects a broader shift in perspective from studying just government to understanding governance, which encompasses a wider array of actors and processes both inside and outside the state. And there are different flavors, like historical, rational choice, and sociological institutionalism, each offering a slightly different lens on how institutions shape political life.
What initially challenged its dominance, and then how did it manage to adapt and make this remarkable comeback? Because it sounds like it faded for a while.
It did. Its dominance declined in the 1950s and 60s with the rise of behavioralism, systems theory, and later Marxism. Critics accused traditional institutionalism of hyperfactualism, basically, just collecting facts about institutions with little regard for broader theory.
Just description, no explanation?
Kind of, yeah. They argued it ignored non-institutional influences on policy and power, and that it was too state-centered, overlooking the deep links between the state and society. They claimed it described, but didn't adequately explain why institutions behaved as they did or how they changed.
Okay, but it came back.
Despite these criticisms, institutionalism remained significant and has experienced a notable revival since the 1970s. This renewed interest was driven by a growing focus on real-world issues like constitutional reform, public administration, policy analysis.
Right, practical stuff.
Exactly. There was a broader acknowledgement that despite alternative theories suggesting institutions were just reflections of other sources like economic structures or individual choices, state structures and the organization of government do profoundly matter. To neglect them might be dull legalism, perhaps, but to ignore their impact entirely would be a profound mistake. They aren't just neutral arenas, they actively shape political outcomes.
And closely related to understanding how parts work for the whole is functionalism. This sounds like it tries to explain why things persist, why they stick around.
Functionalism, yes. It's the doctrine that social institutions and practices should be understood primarily in terms of the functions they carry out in sustaining the larger social system.
Okay, function over origin.
Right. It focuses on the consequences of phenomena rather than their direct causes. In this view, the whole is seen as more than just a collection of its parts, because the various components are structured by the needs of the overall system.
Can you give an example?
Sure. You can see this methodology in approaches like historical materialism, which interprets the state, law, and ideology in terms of their function in sustaining the class system, or in general systems theory, where each part contributes to the system's equilibrium.
So it's less about why something came to be and more about what it does for the stability and maintenance of the system. Can you elaborate on its significance, especially maybe in conservative thought?
While functionalism never achieved the same dominant academic status in political analysis as it did in sociology, particularly in the US in the 50s and 60s, it had important applications. A key example is the traditional conservative notion of an organic society.
Society as a living body.
Exactly. This analogy views society as a living entity, where each part, family, church, businesses, government, plays a particular necessary role in sustaining the whole and maintaining its health. So the continued existence of an institution, say the monarchy, might be defended precisely because it performs a function, like generating social cohesion or national unity, even if its original purpose has faded.
Interesting justification.
Functionalism's greatest impact on academic political analysis probably came in the early post-1945 period, linked to the application of the systems model of political interaction. However, functionalism's star has faded somewhat since the 1960s. It's been criticized in two main ways. Firstly, for reductionism, meaning it tends to strip the state and political institutions of independent meaning, interpreting them only in terms of their role within the broader political system. It often fails to see institutions as having inherent value or agency beyond their systemic function, almost reducing them to mere cogs.
Okay. And the second criticism?
Secondly, functionalism is often seen as implicitly, sometimes explicitly, conservative. If the most important thing about institutions is their role in maintaining society, then existing institutions are often taken for granted as worthwhile. Their mere survival becomes their own defense, regardless of other considerations, making it harder to critique or challenge the status quo.
It's almost like these approaches build on each other, or perhaps react to each other, isn't it? They seem to be constantly in dialogue, trying to refine how we look at political life, each pushing the boundaries of the others.
Absolutely. They represent an ongoing intellectual conversation. Each approach highlights different aspects of political reality and, in doing so, often reveals the limitations or maybe the biases of others. It's less about finding a single right way to look at politics, and maybe more about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each lens.
All right, let's move to how some approaches try to explain the entire political process, or the fundamental driving forces behind it. We'll start with systems theory, which offers this grand, overarching model for understanding how everything connects.
Systems theory, right. It aims to explain the entire political process, along with the functions of major political actors, through the application of systems analysis. A system here is conceived as an organized, complex whole, a set of interrelated and interdependent parts that form a collective entity.
Okay.
When applied to politics, it constructs a model of a political system, most famously characterized by linkages between inputs and outputs.
So it's about understanding what goes in and what comes out, almost like a political machine. Can you walk us through the inputs, outputs, and that crucial feedback loop?
Certainly. On the input side, you have demands and supports coming from the general public.
Demands alike.
Demands can be anything from pressure for higher living standards, better employment, more welfare payments, to calls for greater protection of rights. These are the needs and desires bubbling up from society.
And supports.
Supports are the ways the public contributes to the political system. Paying taxes, complying with laws, participating in public life like voting. Basically, keeping the system going.
Okay, and the outputs?
The outputs are the decisions and actions of the government. That includes making policy, passing laws, imposing taxes, allocating public funds, the stuff government does.
Yeah, right.
These outputs then generate feedback, which in turn shapes future demands and supports from the public, creating this continuous loop.
Ah, the feedback loop.
Exactly. The key insight of the systems model is that the political system tends towards long-term equilibrium and stability, as its very survival depends on aligning its outputs with its inputs. It's constantly trying to find a balance.
That sounds like a very neat, almost mechanical way of looking at politics. Who pioneered this, and what were its key insights?
This approach was pioneered by David Easton in the 1950s, and it was closely linked to behavioralism, actually. Part of that broader attempt to introduce more scientific rigor, drawing analogies from models of ecological systems in biology.
Like ecosystem seeking balance.
Precisely. Systems theory provided rich insights, for instance, into the role of gatekeepers, like political parties and pressure groups, which regulate the flow of inputs into the system. They act as filters, deciding which demands get amplified and which get ignored. It also helped illuminate the general policy process and the nature of its outputs. Its strengths lie in its broad scope, going beyond just state institutions or class structures to include all politically significant actors, and its tendency to foster holistic thinking about how different parts interact.
It sounds incredibly comprehensive. But were there limitations or criticisms, given how complex and often chaotic real-world politics can be? A neat model might miss things.
Yes, definitely. A major criticism is that the systems model is, at best, a device for conceptual understanding. It doesn't in itself constitute reliable knowledge or a predictive theory.
Just a framework.
Pretty much. For instance, institutions like parties and pressure groups are far more complex than just being gatekeepers. They also actively manage public perceptions and shape demands, not just regulate them. Moreover, the model is generally better at explaining how political systems respond to popular pressures than it is at explaining instances of repression or coercion, which, let's face it, all systems employ to some degree. It struggles to account for sudden revolutionary change or fundamental shifts in power.
And you mentioned conservatism earlier.
Yes. A significant critique is that the systems model is implicitly conservative. By highlighting the responsiveness and inherent stability of, say, liberal democracies, it arguably conceals their structural weaknesses and internal contradictions, presenting a somewhat sanitized view of power.
So it emphasizes order and stability over conflict and fundamental change. Which brings us neatly to an approach that sees conflict as the very engine of change. The dialectic. This sounds like a very different way of looking at how things develop.
The dialectic, yes. It's fundamentally a process of development brought about by conflict between opposing forces. It's about tension and resolution, where ideas or social conditions evolve through a series of clashes.
Like Plato's dialogues.
Exactly. Plato's philosophical method is often called dialectical. It's the development of an argument through dialogue, with Socrates challenging ideas, exposing inconsistencies, to arrive at a deeper truth.
And Hegel really took this concept to a grander scale, didn't he? Explaining not just arguments, but history itself through this lens.
He did. G.W.F. Hegel explained the process of reasoning, and indeed all of human and natural history, in terms of a dialectical theory. For Hegel, both thought and reality develop through a constant conflict.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
That's the famous triad. A thesis, an idea or state of affairs, generates its internal negation, the antithesis. From the conflict or interaction of these two opposing forces emerges a higher stage of development, the synthesis.
And the cycle repeats.
Right. The synthesis then, in turn, becomes a new thesis, perpetuating the cycle towards some determinate endpoint, ultimately leading, in Hegel's view, to greater freedom or self-realization.
And then Marx took Hegel's idea and, to put it simply, flipped it on its head, making it about material conditions rather than just ideas.
Exactly. By contrast with Hegel's philosophical idealism, Karl Marx gave the dialectic a materialist interpretation. For Marx, the driving force of history wasn't the conflict of ideas, but rather the internal contradictions within class society, which manifest most clearly as class conflict.
So, slave owners versus slaves, capitalists versus workers.
Precisely. He saw history as a progression of class struggles. This is a crucial distinction, grounding the dialectic in material conditions of human existence.
What makes this approach so powerful, and where does it perhaps fall short in understanding modern politics?
The strength of the dialectical method lies in its ability to draw attention to inherent tensions or contradictions within belief systems and social structures. This often provides important insights into the nature of change, showing that change isn't always smooth or linear, but can be revolutionary and disruptive.
Okay.
Additionally, by emphasizing relationships and interdependence, dialectics can contribute to a holistic perspective, recognizing that elements of a system are interconnected. It's even been used to analyze ecological processes.
But it's not widely used now.
It plays a relatively minor part in conventional social and political analysis today. Its main drawbacks are that, by always linking change to internal contradictions, it can overemphasize conflict in society. It suggests all progress must come through struggle. Furthermore, as seen with Hegel and later Engels, the dialectic was sometimes elaborated into this sweeping metaphysical system, supposedly operating in nature as well, which makes it less verifiable.
Right.
And it's also important to note that dialectical materialism, that crude, deterministic form of Marxism dominant in Orthodox communist states, was actually coined by Georgy Plekhanov, not Marx himself.
Ah, interesting distinction. And this leads us directly to Marx's broader theory of history, historical materialism. This sounds like the grand theory of societal evolution.
Yes, historical materialism is Karl Marx's theory of history, which Engels called the materialist conception of history. It fundamentally highlights the importance of economic life, the conditions under which people produce and reproduce their means of subsistence.
The base and superstructure idea.
Exactly. Simplistically, this is reflected in the belief that the economic base, the mode of production, its technology, its social relations conditions, or determines the ideological and political superstructure.
Which includes?
Everything else, politics, law, religion, art, even family structures. Marx famously asserted that social being determines consciousness. So historical materialism explains social, historical, cultural development in terms of material and class factors, arguing these are the ultimate drivers of change.
So if the economy is the base, it shapes everything else above it. But there was a considerable debate about how rigid that connection was, right? Was it a
Right.
strict one-way street?
Precisely. There's been considerable debate about that base-superstructure relationship. While the simplified view suggests direct one-way determination, Marx's early writings are more dialectical, acknowledging a two-way relationship. Humans shape their material conditions, which in turn shape their consciousness.
Okay, more interactive.
Yes. Engels later tried to clarify this by describing economic factors as the ultimately determining element in history, implying an overarching but not necessarily immediate or exclusive influence. This softer interpretation suggests economics are fundamental, but other factors can play a role, at least short-term.
Right.
And again, it's crucial to distinguish historical materialism from dialectical materialism, which was that more mechanistic Soviet-style interpretation reducing everything to economic causality.
What's its enduring legacy and what kind of pushback did it face, given its grand claims about history? It's obviously hugely influential.
Immensely so. Historical materialism has been the philosophical cornerstone of Marxism, providing the basis for analysis for generations of thinkers. Its attraction lies in its promise to explain virtually all aspects of social and political existence, claiming to uncover processes conventional theory might ignore. It establishes what Lenin called the primacy of economics. It offered a seemingly comprehensive theory for understanding capitalism's development and its eventual overthrow. However, it faces several criticisms. Philosophically, its assumptions about how material production impacts consciousness are questioned. Critics argue ideas and culture can also drive change independently.
Sure.
There are also technical difficulties with the precise meaning and relationship between base and superstructure, making it hard to apply consistently. Moreover, as even neo-Marxists accept, it can overstate economics, threatening materialist reductionism, reducing everything to an economic cause.
And the logical problem.
The final crucial problem is logical. If the base deterministically shapes the superstructure, the theory becomes overly determinist, leaving little room for human agency or choice. But if it doesn't strictly determine it, then the theory loses its strong predictive value. It's a fundamental dilemma.
You can really see how these deep, often contrasting explanations try to get at the very essence of how societies change and function. They grapple with the fundamental forces, whether economic, intellectual, or structural. Okay, now let's zoom out a bit to the broad landscape of political inquiry itself, starting with political philosophy. It feels like the oldest and perhaps most fundamental of these approaches, asking those big, timeless questions.
It certainly is. Political philosophy is often viewed as a subfield of ethics or moral philosophy. It's primarily preoccupied with prescriptive or normative questions.
The ought questions.
Exactly. Questions of what should be, what ought to be, or what must be brought about, rather than simply what is. Its central inquiries are timeless. Why should I obey the state? Who should rule? How should rewards be distributed justly? What are the limits of individual freedom? It's essentially about the ideal political life and the principles that should guide it.
So it's less about describing political reality and more about evaluating it and thinking about ideals. It's about building a better world, at least in theory.
Exactly. Academic political philosophy has two main tasks. First, critically evaluating political beliefs using reasoning to test their coherence and implications. And second, clarifying and refining concepts used in political discourse, like what do we really mean by justice or liberty?
Okay.
While it strives for intellectual rigor, it can't be objective in the same way an empirical science might claim to be, because it's inherently concerned with justifying certain viewpoints and upholding particular understandings of concepts over others.
So it's distinct from political science.
Clearly distinct,
Yeah.
although it often overlaps with political theory. While the terms are sometimes used interchangeably, political philosophy strictly deals with evaluation and advocacy, whereas political theory is broader, encompassing explanation and analysis, cutting across both normative and empirical divides.
Can you trace its historical journey, including its supposed death? And it's a remarkable comeback. It sounds like it went through quite a rough patch.
It did. Political philosophy represents the traditional approach,
Yeah.
dating back to ancient Greece, Plato, Aristotle. Their ideas still resonate.
Absolutely.
Revived in the medieval period by Augustine and Aquinas, integrating with religion. Then in the early modern period by social contract theorists, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau grappling with political authority. Advanced in the 19th century by J.S. Mill on freedom and Marx with his materialist conception.
A long lineage.
Very long. However, from the late 19th century, its status gradually weakened with the rise of those empirical and scientific traditions, positivism, behavioralism. By the 1950s and 60s, there was this frontal assault on normative theorizing. Concepts like justice, rights, liberty were declared meaningless if not empirically verifiable.
Declared dead.
Seriously.
In some academic circles, yes, it was literally declared dead or relegated to mere historical curiosity, not serious contemporary inquiry.
But it made a comeback. What fueled that resurgence?
Yeah.
Seems like you can't suppress fundamental questions for too long.
Indeed, there has been a significant revival since the 1970s. The tendency now is for political philosophy and political science to be seen less as rivals, more as complementary ways of disclosing knowledge.
What drove it?
Several factors. Growing disillusionment with the strictures of behavioralism, which felt too narrow. A recognition that values underpin all political inquiry, even scientific ones, and the emergence of pressing new philosophical debates, feminism, environmental ethics, the liberalism versus communitarianism debate. It showed that fundamental questions about how society should be ordered just wouldn't go away.
So, if political philosophy asks what should be, how does political theory fit into this landscape? Is it more of an umbrella term?
Political theory is a broader concept. In academic discourse, a theory is an explanatory proposition, an idea or set of ideas imposing order or meaning. All inquiry uses theories or hypotheses. So, political science has an important theoretical component. The idea that social class determines voting or revolutions happen with rising expectations. These are examples of empirical political theory. They're explanatory propositions testable against evidence. However, political theory is also often seen as a distinctive approach itself, the analytical study of ideas and doctrines central to political thought. Traditionally, this meant the history of political thought. Major thinkers, classic texts.
Right, studying Plato, Machiavelli, etc.
Exactly. This approach is deeply concerned with ethical and normative questions, justice, freedom, equality, and often has a literary analysis character, examining what thinkers said, how they justified it, their context.
And there's a more recent formal political theory as well, right? Taking a more mathematical or economic approach.
Yes. An alternative called formal political theory has emerged. It draws heavily on economic theory, building models based on procedural rules like rational choice theory, which we'll get to.
Okay. So how does it differ from philosophy again?
While they overlap hugely, a distinction can be drawn. Political theory might content itself with explanation and analysis of ideas, while political philosophy inevitably engages in evaluation and advocacy, actively arguing for certain positions or moral frameworks.
It sounds like political theory had a similar rough patch to political philosophy. Can you expand on its revival and its modern characteristics? What does it look like today?
Indeed. As an approach embracing normative analysis, political theory is arguably the longest tradition, but its status was seriously damaged by positivism's attack on its core subject matter normative concepts.
Right.
While the idea was abandoned in the 50s, 60s is exaggerated, the behavioral revolution certainly led many analysts away from normative thought. But since the 1960s, political theory has reemerged with new vitality. The sharp distinction from political science faded. You had a new generation of influential theorists like John Rawls on justice, Robert Nozick offering a libertarian counter.
What else fueled it?
growing criticism of behavioralism's limits, and the reemergence of deep ideological divisions, anti-Vietnam War protests, feminism, the new right, new left, all demanding new theoretical frameworks.
So it bounced back, but it's not quite the same as it was before, is it? What are some of its defining modern features?
No, modern political theory has some distinct features. One is a greater emphasis on the role of history and culture in shaping understanding. Interpreting thinkers means accounting for context, and recognizing our own values shape our interpretations.
More self-aware.
Yes. Second, it's become increasingly diffuse and diverse. Liberalism itself fragmented, and powerful new alternatives emerged. Feminism, communitarianism, ecologism alongside Marxism and conservatism.
Less unified.
Definitely. Finally, modern political theory has, in a sense, lost some of the bold self-confidence of earlier periods. It's largely abandoned the traditional search for universal values acceptable to everyone, partly due to appreciating how community shapes values, partly influenced by postmodernism questioning universal truths altogether.
This really shows us that thinking about politics is such a dynamic, evolving field, not just a static set of answers. It's a constant process of questioning, adapting, expanding our frameworks. Okay, let's move into some more contemporary and often debated approaches. First up, rational choice theory. This sounds like it brings economics right into the heart of politics.
Rational choice, yes. It's a broad theoretical approach, sometimes called formal political theory, that draws heavily on economic theory. Its core premise is building models based on procedural rules, usually centered on the assumption that individuals behave in rationally self-interested ways.
Like economic actors.
Exactly. It assumes political actors, like economic actors, consistently choose the most efficient means to achieve their various ends. This idea actually goes way back to thinkers like Hobbes' self-preservation, and it's deeply embedded in utilitarianism, too.
So it's about people making logical calculations to maximize their self-interest, like a consumer trying to get the best deal but applied to politics. Can you break down some of its subdivisions?
Absolutely. It subdivides into a few key areas. There's public choice theory, focusing on providing public goods like clean air or defense, delivered by government because the market struggles with them. It analyzes how self-interested political actors, voters, politicians, bureaucrats make decisions about these goods.
Okay.
Then there's social choice theory, examining the relationship between individual preferences and collective social choices, like how individual votes translate into a societal outcome.
Right, the voting paradoxes and things.
Exactly. And game theory, stemming more from mathematics, analyzes puzzles about individual behavior in strategic situations using first principles. The most famous example is the prisoner's dilemma,
Ah, yes.
which illustrates how even rationally self-interested behavior, if pursued by all, can paradoxically lead to worse outcomes than cooperation would have. Highlights challenges of collective action.
It sounds like it brings a very analytical, almost mathematical rigor to political analysis. What's been its impact and the significant critiques it's faced?
Rational choice theory emerged in the 1950s, gained significant prominence from the 1970s, especially in the U.S., associated with the Virginia School of Economists and Political Scientists.
Okay.
It's been used to provide insights into the actions of voters, lobbyists, bureaucrats, politicians, you name it. Its broadest impact is probably institutional public choice theory, examining how political institutions affect rational actors' choices. Supporters argue it brought rigor, allowed explanatory models like economics. However, it's faced considerable criticism. A primary critique is that it often overestimates human rationality.
People aren't always logical calculators.
Exactly. In reality, people seldom have clear goals, rarely make decisions with full knowledge. Emotions, habits, limited information play huge roles. Furthermore, because it starts from an abstract individual model, it often pays insufficient attention to social and historical factors. It can fail to recognize that self-interest itself might be socially conditioned, not just innate.
And any value bias.
Some critics argue it often carries an inherent conservative value bias, stemming from its initial assumptions. This can be reflected in its use by theorists like Buchanan and Tullock to defend free markets and minimal states, assuming self-interested choices in a free market always lead to the best outcome.
From the very logical, rational individual, let's pivot to an approach that questions fundamental truths and certainty itself. Postmodernism. This sounds like it completely flips the script on how we understand knowledge.
Postmodernism, yes.
A highly controversial and often confusing term. It originally described experimental movements in architecture and culture, primarily originating in continental Europe, and profoundly challenges standard Anglo-American academic political theory.
Okay.
Its foundation lies in a perceived social shift from modernity to postmodernity. Modern societies were seen as structured by industrialization, class solidarity. Postmodern societies, by contrast, are seen as increasingly fragmented, pluralistic information societies, where individualism replaces older group loyalties, linked to post-industrialism, knowledge communication-based society. So it's about a shift in society that then prompts a shift in how we understand knowledge itself. And the central theme is a rejection of certainty, like saying, stop trying to find one single definitive answer.
Exactly. The central theme of postmodernism is that there is no such thing as absolute certainty. The very idea of absolute universal truth must be discarded as an arrogant pretense, an overconfident, false claim to possess universal objective knowledge.
Right.
While not unified, its critical attitude stems from the assumption that all knowledge is partial and local. Post-structuralism, often used interchangeably, emphasizes that all ideas are expressed in language, and language itself is deeply enmeshed in complex power relations. How we talk shapes what we think and how power operates.
That's a powerful critique of traditional ways of thinking, almost a deconstruction. How has it impacted political thought, and what accusations does it face?
Since the 1970s, postmodern and post-structural theories have become increasingly fashionable. They vehemently attack all forms of analysis stemming from modernism, Enlightenment ideas, ideologies like liberalism, Marxism. From a postmodern view, modernism's chief flaw is foundationalism. The belief you can establish objective truths and universal values, often tied to faith in progress and reason solving everything. Lyotard famously defined postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives.
Skepticism towards grand stories.
Exactly. Skepticism about ideologies based on universal history, seeing society as a coherent whole, like Marxism's historical march or liberalism's universal rights. However, postmodernism faces criticism. First, extreme relativism, holding different ways of knowing as equally valid, rejecting even science's ability to distinguish truth-falsehood. If all claims are just stories, how do we judge?
Dangerous, maybe.
Some argue that. Second, conservatism. A non-foundationalist stance offers no basis to critique the existing order or construct alternatives. If there's no objective better, why change? Nevertheless, its attraction is its relentless questioning of apparently solid realities and beliefs. Its emphasis on discourse, debate, democracy reflects that rejecting hierarchies of ideas implies rejecting political social hierarchies too, pushing for more inclusive thinking.
From questioning truth to a hard, often cynical look at power. Realism in international politics. This seems like a polar opposite of the idealism we discussed earlier.
Realism, or political realism, yes. A perspective on international politics fundamentally grounded in power politics and the pursuit of national interests. It's the major alternative to idealism.
Okay, what's its core assumption?
The central assumption is that the state is the principal actor internationally. States are sovereign, autonomous. The rise of nationalism transformed them into cohesive communities where national loyalty trumps others.
So it views the international system as a kind of struggle for survival, a constant competition.
Precisely. The realist tradition portrays international politics as a state of nature, an essentially anarchic system where each state must prioritize its own national interests, basically survival and territorial defense. As a result, realists heavily stress power, typically meaning military capacity or force.
Constant war, then.
Not necessarily endless conflict. Realists believe the pattern conforms largely to a balance of power. States form alliances to balance against rivals, ensuring periods of uneasy peace. They also acknowledge it's not a pure state of nature because power isn't equally distributed. There's a hierarchy of states imposing some order, even if based on dominance.
And there's a distinction between classical realism and neo-realism, isn't there? Trying to make it more systematic.
Yes. Neorealism, or structural realism, modifies classical realism. It explains events through the structure of the international system rather than just individual states' goals. Classical realists might focus on a leader's ambition. Neorealists say the anarchic system compels even well-intentioned states to compete for survival. The system itself drives behavior.
What historical events cemented realism's dominance, and what are its main critiques? It sounds like a very pragmatic, if bleak, view of the world.
Realism became dominant in the 20th century, spurred massively by WWI and WWII. Those conflicts undermined idealist internationalism, showed the naked pursuit of power, especially Nazi expansionism. During the Cold War, realist theories portrayed global politics as bipolar, driven by US-Soviet rivalry. Realists even argued bipolarity maintained peace via nuclear deterrence, MAD, mutually assured destruction. They saw a stable hierarchy keeping anarchy somewhat in check. leading Hedley Bull to call it an anarchical society.
But it faced criticism.
Fierce criticism, the central objection. By divorcing politics from morality, realism arguably legitimizes military escalation and great power ambitions. Critics say power politics hasn't maintained peace, but kept the world on the verge of catastrophe.
Any other critiques?
Feminist theorists argue power-seeking behavior and obsession with security military reflect the dominance of male politicians with aggressive priorities, a gendered bias. Empirically, its focus on the state ignores the rise of non-state actors, international organizations, corporations in the late 20th century. This led towards neorealism, trying to account for systemic factors more broadly.
And finally, two contrasting ideas about what constitutes the good life or a good society: utilitarianism and utopianism. Let's start with utilitarianism, which seems to boil down to a simple calculation.
Utilitarianism, yes. A moral philosophy proposing the rightness of an action, policy, or institution is established by its tendency to promote happiness.
The greatest good for the greatest number.
That's Bentham's classic formula. It assumes individuals are motivated by self-interest, desire for pleasure, happiness, avoiding pain. Individuals are seen as calculating pleasure-pain amounts for each action, choosing the course with greatest pleasure over pain. They try to quantify this utility. Humans are utility maximizers.
So it's about maximizing overall happiness, almost like a moral calculus for society. Are there different variations, or is it always that straightforward equation?
It's developed into a cluster of theories. Classical is act utilitarianism. Judge and act right if its consequences produce at least as much pleasure over pain as alternatives. Rule utilitarianism judges and act right if it conforms to a rule that, if generally followed, produces good consequences. There's also utilitarian generalization, consequences if generally performed, and motive utilitarianism, focus on actors' intentions. So core idea is simple, application can be nuanced.
What has been its impact on policy, and where do its moral dilemmas arise? Because it sounds like it could justify some questionable things if the greater good is the only measure.
Utilitarian theory emerged late 18th century as a supposedly scientific alternative to natural rights, seeking a rational basis for morality. In 19th century UK, it underpinned many reforms, championed by philosophic radicals. A foundation for classical liberalism, still hugely important in moral philosophy impacting policy aimed at public welfare.
What's its appeal?
Its supposed capacity for objective moral judgments just kept the happiness. Rather than imposing values, it lets individuals define their own pleasure-pain, upholding diversity and freedom, respecting others as pleasure-seeking.
But the drawbacks?
Both philosophical and moral. Philosophically, its highly individualistic view of human nature is seen as asocial, ahistorical. It's not certain self-interest is universal. Morally, it can be criticized as crass hedonism. J.S. Mill's Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, arguing not all pleasures are equal.
And the biggest moral issue?
Perhaps most significantly, it could potentially endorse actions widely seen as morally wrong, violating human rights, sacrificing a minority if those actions maximize the general utility or happiness of the majority. Raises very difficult questions about justice and individual dignity.
And to wrap up this fascinating discussion, let's consider the ultimate vision. Utopianism. This is about building that perfect society, isn't it?
Yeah.
The dream scenario.
A utopia, yes. From the Greek, no place or good place, Thomas More's clever pun. It's literally an ideal or perfect society. Utopianism, as a style of theorizing, critiques the existing order by constructing a detailed model of this ideal alternative.
What are its typical features?
Usually three. First, a radical, comprehensive rejection of the status quo present arrangements are fundamentally defective. Second, it highlights potential for human self-development based on optimistic assumptions about human nature or institutions' capacity to foster cooperation. Third, it usually transcends the public-private divide, suggesting complete personal fulfillment, a holistic good life.
So it's not a single political philosophy itself, but a way of envisioning a much better future that often requires a radical break from the present.
Exactly. Utopianism isn't an ideology in itself. Substantive utopias differ significantly, socialist, anarchist, etc. Most abolish want, conflict, violence, oppression. Socialism, anarchism, Marxism lean towards utopianism, belief in sociable human potential, leading to egalitarian societies, collective property, reduced authority.
Others too?
Feminism and ecologism have utopian theories, worlds free from patriarchy or ecological destruction. Liberalism's capacity is constrained by its focus on self-interest, but extreme free market capitalism can be seen as a market utopianism, believing markets solve all problems. Some utopias, like More's original, can even be hierarchical if based on faith in benign, all-knowing government.
What's its historical trajectory? Its decline after being so popular and its modern resurgence?
Most popular in the 19th century, driven by industrialization's upheavals, fueling dreams of a better world, became distinctly unfashionable in the 20th century.
Why the decline?
Criticisms fall into two main categories. First, it's seen as deluded, fanciful, unrealistic, unachievable. Marx denounced utopian socialism as not grounded in reality, contrasting it with scientific socialism, though Marxism's communist end goal is itself quite utopian.
And the second criticism?
That utopianism is implicitly totalitarian, promoting a single set of indisputable values, intolerant of debate diversity, often leading to oppressive regimes trying to force their ideal on everyone. Nevertheless, a revival occurred since the 1960s, linked to the New Left, thinkers like Marcuse, Bloch. Its enduring strength. It enables political theory to think beyond the present, challenge the boundaries of the possible, push us to imagine alternatives. Establishing concrete utopias uncovers potential for growth within existing circumstances. Without such vision, political theory risks being overwhelmed by what is, losing its critical edge and capacity to inspire change.
What a journey through how we try to make sense of the political world, from the tangible and observable to the aspirational and the utterly abstract. It's truly a complex landscape of thought.
Right.
Wow, that was a truly expansive deep dive into the very fabric of how we understand politics.
Right.
From the, hard facts that behavioralism sought to quantify, to the fluid interpretations and radical questioning of postmodernism, and all the way to the aspirational visions of utopianism, it's abundantly clear there is no single monolithic way to approach political understanding.
Not at all. And what's fascinating here is how these approaches aren't just academic curiosities stuck in university halls. They profoundly shape the very questions we ask about society, the policies we debate, even how we view ourselves and our place within it all.
Yeah.
Recognizing these different intellectual lenses allows you to critically evaluate any argument, doesn't it? Understanding its underlying assumptions, what it prioritizes, maybe what it overlooks.
Exactly. It empowers you to see beyond the surface, to decode the often unstated frameworks that shape political discourse. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? As you navigate political discussions, read news analyses, listen to debates, try to identify which approach or lens is being used. Are they primarily focused on observable behavior or deep-seated ideals, structural conflicts?
Are they pursuing universal truths? Or are they highlighting subjective experiences and the role of power in shaping knowledge?
Right. And this raises an important question, I think, considering the strengths and weaknesses of each approach we discussed today.
Yeah.
Which one do you find most compelling or useful for making sense of today's complex political landscape, and why?
That's a great question. Maybe it's a combination of several approaches, or perhaps one feels particularly resonant right now in a world grappling with so many different perspectives.
Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.